Okay, now you can hear me. Hello, everyone. Yes, my name is Olga Tokariuk. I'm from Ukraine. I'm actually a journalist, and then in the second important thing is my affiliation with the Center for European Policy Analysis, but I'm a journalist. I've been working as a journalist in Ukraine for more than 15 years, and I'm working mostly with the foreign media in the last 2 years, telling the stories from Ukraine. And me, as many of my colleagues, were forced to become war reporters. This wasn't a choice. This wasn't something that I was studying for, something that I was striving to do, but I had to do that. I had to become a war reporter because of war that Russia unleashed on my country. Actually, I want to start the session on a personal note. I came here from Poland, from Warsaw, from another conference that I attended there. And I crossed the land border from Ukraine to Poland, something that I haven't done for many years, because as all of you, I usually took flights to get from one point to another. Now there is no possibility to take a flight from Ukraine, obviously, because Ukrainian airports have been bombed by Russia and there is no air connection to Ukraine. So while crossing this border between Ukraine and Poland, I was looking at that border when my bus was stopped at it. We were waiting for a while. And I looked at the lights at the border. It was a late evening. And I thought that this is a border now between war and peace. This is a border between safety and danger. And this is also a border, and as it was in previous years, between a country that is a member of the EU and NATO and the country that isn't. And I think this, ultimately, the fact that Ukraine wasn't integrated fully into Western alliances, into Western security architecture, despite its desire, despite the fight and the plight of Ukrainian people to be one, ultimately, and they enabled this Russian aggression. Ukraine was left in a security vacuum, and it is paying a huge price for that. And I want everyone to be aware of this. So this is one of the questions that I want us to discuss today. Is this war and the fight that Ukrainians are now showing incredible determination and resilience and incredible faith in their victory, will this be enough for the West to finally accept Ukraine as its integral part and to integrate it into the structures that will enable and will ensure the safety and security of future generations of Ukrainians? So, actually, it feels quite, also surreal to be here in peaceful European Union, in Vienna, where life seems so normal, when my loved ones, my child, has to listen to the sounds of the air raid sirens and has to go to the basement basically every day and every night, when she has nightmares about her house being bombed. And of course, I still consider myself and my family lucky because we were able to go to Western Ukraine, where we are currently based, before the war, actually. So my child didn't see the bombs falling and that she didn't hear the sounds of explosions, but still she has nightmares, and still she knows that there is war, and still her future hangs in the balance, as many millions of Ukrainians who have seen the war with their own eyes, who were forced to leave their houses, who lost their loved ones, who lost everything they were building for so many years. And me also as a journalist and as a representative of Ukrainian civil society, when I'm speaking to my colleagues and Ukrainian civil society members, people who are fighting for all these years to reform Ukraine, to transform it, to integrate it further with the European Union, we are all asking ourselves the same question. Was everything that we were building in vain? Will it be destroyed now? What will remain from our efforts, from our work that we were conducting for all these years and decades since Ukraine became independent in 1991? So, as I said, Ukrainians are showing remarkable resilience and determination to defend their country. And this caught, in fact, some people in the West by surprise. And unfortunately, we are hearing voices calling, expressing concern over a potential Ukraine's victory, fearing that it might humiliate or destabilize Russia. The voices that are putting the interests of the aggressor country over that of the victim. Other voices call on Ukraine to make concessions to help Russian dictator Putin save face. Well, this is, of course, unacceptable to Ukrainians, and it sounds cynical after the bombing of Mariupol and the massacre of Bucha. And we have a person from Bucha today with us, Maria. Thank you for being here. So what will Ukraine's victory look like? We have to think about that before thinking about the rebuilding, how we will rebuild Ukraine. And here I want to quote Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmitro Kuleba, who was addressing just minutes ago. So he said in one of his recent interviews that Ukraine's victory will consist of 4 points. And I think this Ukrainian perspective is really important to be heard and to be understood in the West, as many here are debating what will the outcome of this war look like. So what Ukrainians want and how they see their victory. So the first point is the liberation of the occupied territories, including Crimea and Donbass. Second is the payment of reparations. The third point is the prosecution of Russian war criminals. And we know that the first trial of a Russian soldier accused of committing a war crime has started in Kyiv 2 days ago. And finally, the fourth point is Ukraine's integration into the EU. And I think this fourth point is especially important to be underlined as I'm speaking to you here and to be discussed today. As a person who participated in 2 Ukrainian democratic revolutions and who is a firm believer and fighter for Ukraine's European integration, I can't stress enough how important it is for Ukraine to be granted an EU candidate status at the summit in June. Not only it will be a recognition, not by words, but by deeds, that Ukraine belongs to the European family and to the Western democratic world, it will also provide an important boost to Ukrainian self-confidence and determination to win the war and continue the transformation of their country. The EU conditionality would serve as a guiding light for Ukrainian reformers and its vibrant civil society, which made remarkable progress in the last 8 years in the fight against corruption and strengthening of democratic institutions. And it also will be instrumental in rebuilding Ukraine. So finally, to sum up, I recently spoke to Ukraine's infrastructure minister and actually asked him, how will Ukraine will be rebuilt? What will you need for this? And what is your plan? And one important thing that he said was, we cannot rebuild a half of the city that has been destroyed. We have to rebuild the whole city to make it modern, to make it different, to make it prosperous. And I think this ambitious thinking and the spirit of Ukrainians is very illustrative of the whole country. It's not just the thinking of one person. Having paid with so many lives for their desire to live in a free country, Ukrainians are determined to rebuild a new Ukraine and to make it successful and prosperous. And the question is, how committed is Europe to help them? So with that, I want to give the floor to the keynote speakers and to kick off this debate today, focusing on Ukraine's victory, how it will look like, what is Europe prepared to do for that, and how will Ukraine be rebuilt. So I want to welcome Serhii Plokhy and Natalie Tocci, who will deliver their remarks, their keynote speeches. Then I'll ask them several questions, and then I invite other speakers also to join the debate, everyone who is on stage, and also you in the audience. Please think of the questions that you would want to ask. We will have 20 minutes in the end of the session for you to answer, to ask your questions. So. I would invite Serhii Plokhy to start with his speech. No, I think you should, I don't know, like how does it?
Excellent, thank you. Thank you very much, Olga, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to address this audience. I will start my short presentation with something that is in the description, very well done description of the conference, the opening sentence in particular, which reads, in the early hours of 24th of February 2022, Europe woke up to a grave new world. Something considered unthinkable after World War II had happened and the European security order was blown up. You can hear almost there in those sentences, and that reflects the attitude at the time and the attitude still today, the surprise about this happening. And the question almost is there between the lines is why? why we are in this very new, very dramatic and tragic and dangerous situation. The justifications for the war that were given by the Russian leadership and Vladimir Putin in particular are confusing at best. But there is one thing that is very clear from those explanations that were given. There are two overriding themes that are there, and one of them is NATO, which means really the West, and which means in that particular context Europe, and Ukraine. The war of 2022 that caught Europe by surprise didn't really start on the February 24th of this year. It started back in 2014 with the annexation of the Crimea, the first annexation of territory of another state in Europe since the end of World War II. And the trigger, if not the cause for the war, was very clear. That was the Euro revolution and Euromaidan in Ukraine, and insistence of the Ukrainian society on signing the association agreement with European Union. So not NATO, not even membership in the European Union. Association agreement with the European Union. That is at the foundation. This is the beginning of this war, and this is the beginning of this conflict. And we shouldn't allow discussions about NATO going back to the borders of '97, or about Nazis capturing somehow Ukraine, and nationalists distract us from that key point. It is about Ukraine's European orientation and European integration. And this is the choice that Ukrainians have been defending since 2014 and are defending today. And the question that maybe is quite uncomfortable outside of Ukraine is the question of how many people outside of Ukraine are prepared to sacrifice, not just their lives, but sacrifice in any way for the ideas of Europe, for the ideas of European integration. So it is a wake-up call in many ways to Europe in its many and different incarnations, from the European Union to the European values in general, to the military organization and NATO in particular. Sometimes you hear that, well, Ukrainians are doing really something smart in this war, speaking about Ukraine, speaking about Europe, and about defending European values. Well, one thing that as a historian I can tell to you is that it's not a trick. The people who fight in Ukraine and say that they're fighting for European values and for European orientation, they actually mean what they say. And there are numerous reasons for that. But one of them is that the modern Ukrainian national project, the way how it was formed in the mid-19th century, like modern national projects of the majorities of the countries in the region, it was born with the idea of Europe in front of it. Mykhailo, one of the key 19th century political thinker in Ukraine, was thinking about the future of Ukraine as a part of European federation. So European project emerged as a project of separating from the Russian Empire. And either European Federation or Europe as a whole has been that other pole of Ukrainian identity, at least since the 19th century. The communism, very interestingly, changed very little about that orientation, as in the 1920s, we have the movement, the cultural movement toward Europe and away from Moscow. And when in the 1970s and the 1980s, the human rights movement starts, and in Ukraine they create this Helsinki group, the second one in the Soviet Union after Moscow. The first statement, the first manifesto of that group is, "We are living in Europe." Well, probably Europe didn't suspect about that, but that was part of the Ukrainian thinking through all these times and through all these different periods and ideologies. Now, with the war, or all-out war, that started today and continues, the destruction continues, the loss of life continues. What is there about Ukraine in Europe, again, as I said, in numerous incarnations, and what are the lessons that we can learn from the past? One of them comes from the fact that Olga has already alluded to, and this is the fact that Ukraine ended up, since 1994, in the no man's land, in the gray zone, not being integrated into the security structures. Ukraine was forced to give up its nuclear weapons in 1994 to the great happiness of the rest of the world. But it was given nothing but the empty promises that were put together in the Budapest Memorandum. And if these lessons will not be learned, we will actually have another conflict, another war, and again, we don't know yet where this war will end, but the next one will be probably bigger if you compare 2014, 2015, and now 2022. That's the tendency. That's the direction. The security structure is certainly one of the issues that is on the agenda, and more specifically is, of course, either NATO membership or other security arrangement that has to include Europe one way or another. Whatever structure it will be, whatever the umbrella it will be, it has to include Europe, and Europe has to be prepared for that. In Ukraine, there is a joke that it's time not for Kyiv to apply for membership in NATO, but it's time for NATO to apply to join Ukraine in that fight. The big issue is, of course, the going beyond security, and this is the issue of the European EU membership and candidate status. That's on the agenda of Kyiv today. That's on the agenda of President Zelensky and Kuleba, and this is something that Ukrainians really, in many ways, are fighting for today again, because they're fighting for their European choice, and if membership is not part of that choice, the question is what it is. Looking beyond this war that no one, first of all, expected that would last more than 2 or 3 days, the Washington and Brussels and Moscow disagreed almost on anything regarding Ukraine without one exception. That exception was that the war would not last for more than 2 or 3 days. It's now in its third month or maybe more. It sounds like years, at least third year. It feels, not sounds, like at least third year. And it turns in the way that very few people expected. The aggressor has stopped, and there is a possibility, again, Ukraine is already pushing back, and after winning the battle for Kyiv, recapturing and regaining control of its territories. The same is happening in environs of Kharkiv, the city 40 to 50 miles away from the Russian border, which was shelled and repeatedly for months, weeks and months. There is a lot of destruction, and no more destruction than is in city of Mariupol. And it is all over TV, it's all over the newspapers. We know what it is. We know how it looks. It looks terrible. It looks also, the city that the life, whatever life was there, was taken away from that. But I want to say something that also might sound as a little bit controversial under these circumstances. Because what is being destroyed in Ukraine is more than buildings. What is destroyed in Ukraine are the remnants of the Soviet thinking and Soviet mentality and Soviet geopolitical orientations. What is being destroyed in Ukraine is also very often the infrastructure and the industry that goes back to the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century and the beginning of the industrialization of Donetsk and Donbass. And when we think about rebuilding of Ukraine, the word and the operational word probably shouldn't be rebuilding per se, or at least the meaning that should be put in this word. This is about building new Ukraine, and building new Ukraine in more than one way. And that project is extremely ambitious. And it's impossible without outside help. And that's where Europe comes in. As a historian, I can say you that things like that were done in the past. Things like that were done in the past, and the name for those projects, which turned out to be very successful, was the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan, as you know, was about the American money coming to Europe and helping to rebuild Europe. Now the time has come when the American money would be matched by European money to rebuild part of Eastern Europe and make Europe whole and free in the borders where the people actually want that freedom, want that holiness, and actually are prepared to die for it. I will end here, and I'm sure that again, I look forward to the presentation by Natalie, and I'm sure we'll have a very interesting and productive discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Serhii, for this very important and interesting presentation highlighting the historical links and roots of Ukraine with Europe, with the Western civilization, and also drawing the attention to the fact that it's Europe that should be playing a leading role in rebuilding Ukraine after Ukraine's victory. Natalie, I want to turn to you now, Natalie Tocci from the Institute of International Affairs in Rome, Istituto Affari Internazionali. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Olga. I'll stand up. Is this working? Yeah, I think it is. Stand up so I can't really see you, but at least hopefully you'll see me. So I think woven into the question of how to rebuild Ukraine is really, I think, the question of when to rebuild Ukraine and what are we talking about when we're rebuilding Ukraine. And I guess the sort of story that I'm going to be presenting over the next few minutes is really one of a glass half full and a glass half empty. And as you know, always, let me begin with the glass half empty. And I do so because I really want to make the distinction between the physical rebuilding of Ukraine and the political rebuilding of Ukraine. Now, the physical rebuilding of Ukraine is really the glass half empty. And why is it the glass half empty? I think it's the glass half empty because, as we have heard in the words of the Ukrainian foreign minister, as we have heard in the words of the Estonian prime minister, we need to be very clear about what have been the causes of this war. Had this war been a war driven by security considerations, by geopolitics, by basically a set of quote-unquote rational motivations, which would then eventually lead to a situation a few weeks, months down the line, in which Russia, having realized that it would not achieve the aims that it had set itself out, meaning those security considerations, would ultimately get to, rationally step back and be willing to compromise. Now, that argument, of course, clashes with the reality that this is a war being driven by ideas and ideology. And given that this is a war being driven by an ideology, it is very difficult to imagine how we could somehow get to a situation in a few months down the line in which one could sit down and reach a good peace settlement with Russia. And normally, when we talk about the physical rebuilding after a war, normally this is kind of how it tends to go. Yeah, you have a war, then you have a ceasefire, then you have a peace settlement, and then the physical rebuilding begins. But what if that is not how this war is going to play out? What if we get to a situation in which Russia's political willingness, so long as the Kremlin is what we know it today, will remain unaltered because this is an ideology-driven war. Its ability will reduce, and this may well lead, and as in fact we are to an extent already seeing, a de-escalation of sorts, But that de-escalation does not lead to a peace settlement. And I think this kind of raises the real question, which I think is a question for Ukraine to ask itself, for us to discuss together as Europeans, obviously with Ukraine, what do we mean by this reconstruction? When does it take place? You know, if we're in a situation in which de-escalation does not mean the end of a war, is there a rebuilding which is then redestroyed and it's then rebuilt? I mean, you know, I don't have an answer to this question, right? But I think that precisely because that physical rebuilding, as Serhii was, I think, very rightly pointing out, is not simply the rebuilding of buildings. I mean, it's the rebuilding of the economic fundamentals of a country. You need to make sure that when it's rebuilt, it really is kind of rebuilt and not destroyed a few weeks down the line. And I fear that as Russia's ability reduces, but its intent does not, it may not be able to win the war in the way in which it thought, but it wants to make sure that at least Ukraine does not win that war, and preventing that physical rebuilding by occasionally going in and bombing X, Y, or Z is something that can actually be sustained for a very long time. And that is, in the sense that that's why I wanted to start with that glass half empty. I think this is a very, as I said, I don't have an answer to this question. Now, let me turn to kind of move on to the slightly more upbeat part of this, this presentation, to another, I think, meaning of what rebuilding means, and it's really the political rebuilding of Ukraine. And I think that's the glass half full because it's already happening. I think, as Serhii was pointing out, in a sense, the seeds were already there, but it's very clear that these seeds have blossomed already. I mean, they have blossomed already to the extent that essentially the way in which Ukraine is consolidating itself as a nation is essentially really rooted in its civic understanding as a nation. And so you basically see, as always takes place in war, nationalism obviously being a very important feature in this war, but the nationalism that is driving Ukraine, precisely because it's quote-unquote othering vis-a-vis Russia, can only really posit Ukraine as a civic nation. You basically see the civic form of nationalism, which is, I think, really, sort of really forms the basis of what this political building and rebuilding of Ukraine is all about. Now, having said this, I also think that as always, it is not a done deal. And as always, there can be steps forward, but then there can always also be steps back. And if we look at the way and the political development of other nations, we see indeed that there can come a time where, although in a sense nationalism and liberalism are intertwined for a while, they can then start diverging. And here I'm looking at Susanna, that indeed comes indeed from a country where that divergence has very much taken place. And so the question in here is where I end really with Europe, is what can we do to ensure, in fact, not only for Ukraine, but for everyone, right, that divergence does not take place, that Ukraine remains sort of its political rebuilding remains entrenched in a civic understanding of the nation. And I think this is basically where Europe and European integration come in. And on this, I think, we have to be very clear. In a credible accession process, which is basically, if we take the example of Central and Eastern Europe, we're talking about a process that lasted a decade. In an accession process that is not particularly credible, and here I look at my neighbor to the right, we're talking about a process that lasts, who knows, well, certainly 20 years and ongoing. And even in that credible scenario, this is too long. So we, in any case, need to think of what the European Union as it begins, and I agree, I hope very much that candidacy will be recognized, but my point is that to ensure that that political rebuilding is ongoing, as I said, embedded upon a civic understanding of the nation, there needs to be something else alongside an accession process. And there needs to be, in a sense, real political delivery to Ukraine, not in 10 years' time, but in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and more years' time. Now, I think that is one important piece of the equation. I think the second important piece of the equation is that we also need to make sure that it's not only the accession process itself, which is complemented by real delivery along the way, but also that there are reforms within the European Union to ensure that once you're in the European Union, we don't end up, indeed, as Hungary has ended up. So what are the internal mechanisms of, if you like, conditionality to ensure that not only when you're out, but also when you're in, that political rebuilding, which I say, we're talking here about Ukraine, but this is really relevant for any country, right, remains ongoing. And I'll stop there, Olga.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for raising these important points and challenges also that concern both the rebuilding of Ukraine, the moment when to start this rebuilding, how it will look like, how to ensure there is no new Russian aggression. And I think this was also, it's a very important question that was also raised previously by the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas in her speech. She said, how do we make sure that Russia does not attempt another war of aggression in Europe? I think that's something that we should be thinking of. Well, I have an answer for now in Ukraine, and of course, it has to do with money. Russia has to be weakened economically. Russia has to be deprived of its huge oil and gas revenues that it uses to finance, to fund this war effort. But long-term solutions should be developed too that also will have to deal probably with also working with the ideology, with the motivation that you mentioned. So thank you for this important perspective. And I will now ask questions to our keynote speakers, and I actually have a question that I want to ask to both of you, both Serhii and Natalie. So, Serhii, especially you wrote in your books, and you mentioned today in your speech about these connections and the rooting of Ukrainian, actually, democracy in its European legacy and historical also roots of Ukraine's links to Europe. But there is still a notion, or there was a notion of Ukraine that was very prevalent in Western Europe, especially of Ukraine as a bridge between Russia and Europe, as a bridge between civilizations. Do you think this perception is changing as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine, and especially as a result of Ukrainians' fight for democracy and freedom? So this is a question both to you, Serhii, and also to you, Natalie, which you maybe will have a more skeptical look at this.
Sure. Well, thank you. The metaphor of a bridge is, of course, there. I, in my own work, also use the metaphor of gates of Europe, which can be open and can be closed. And it depends on the time and in the circumstances. And if you go back to the metaphor of the bridge, the bridges are there and they work when whoever is on the two sides of the river actually want to communicate, want to work, and need channels for communication. And I don't think that this is the situation in which we are now. And for that reason, at least for now, that bridge is being blown up, it being shelled, it being just destructed. And doesn't mean that the bridge will not be rebuilt, But that's not the current state of the situation. And if I can address also what Natalie was saying, very, very interesting ideas about, and the question, when does the war end? Looking at the fact that we really don't know exactly or don't agree fully where the war started, whether that was 24th of February of 2022 or it was March of 2014 with the annexation of the Crimea, that of course adds special gravity to the question of where does it end. And there is historically no easy questions. There are no peace treaty between Russia and Japan till today. Technically, the World War II is not over, at least when you look on that level. But there are also things that I think would indicate very clearly the end of the war, or would lead to the end of the war. And one of them is the integration into European structures of Ukraine. That will be one marker. And another one, Natalie mentioned the question that, okay, this is a war ideological, and okay, if it's ideological, how do you end it? And from my perspective, the ideological part is very much part about the disintegration of the empire. And it is about the refusal of the metropoly to allow the former province to take and assume its own identity, especially in the context in which Putin keeps saying Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people. So basically a denying right for the nation to exist as such. Well, one thing that is very clear with this war is that among things that are being destroyed is also whatever sense of the East Slavic unity that existed in Ukraine, because the cities that are being bombed and constructed and destructed, Kharkiv, Mariupol, these are the cities in east and south of Ukraine with the highest percentage of Russian speakers. The majority of the people there speak Russian, and the highest percentage of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. And what I see in my Facebook account, on my Twitter, that leaves little doubt, at least for me, that at least for generations to come, that thing came to an end when it comes to Ukraine identity and relation to Russia. So in that sense, again, this war also it seems to me contributing to this process. And finally, on rebuilding not just economy and politics, I can't agree more. There are foundations, but there is, of course, a lot to build on. Ukraine still doesn't have, or almost doesn't have, parties that would not be organized and led by a charismatic leader. Zelensky and Zelensky's party is one of those cases. But also in terms of the structure of economy. Because if and once there is Marshall Plan, or whatever is the name for that, the task of it is also to restructure the Ukrainian economy and politics as well, which is still now has been still dominated by the oligarchs, and that's another big issue about rebuilding and transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Serhii. Natalie. Please.
Yes, so on the bridge question, I think sort of Ukraine was seen as a bridge in at least two phases since the end of the Cold War. So let's say phase one, which I would call the sort of age of idealism, end of the Cold War up until, I would say, round about maybe 2008 or so, which, in which you had, on the one hand, of course, the war in Georgia, but also the global financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis. Let's say that first phase, age of idealism, free, open space from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and so Ukraine as a bridge in that construction, if you like. Then I would say, and this is when it starts getting problematic, Ukraine keeps on being seen as a bridge. Between round about that time, so obviously including then 2014, up until the 24th of February. And I would characterize that second phase as, in a sense, an age of pragmatism. Pragmatism, which cut both sides in the sense that indeed there was this kind of growing awareness that Russia represented a challenge, still not talked about as a threat, but certainly a challenge. And so, yes, we need to kind of impose sanctions, but then, Russia is there, it's not going to disappear, and therefore we need to, engage with Russia in different shapes and forms. And Ukraine kept on, therefore, in that construction, being seen as a bridge, to the extent of, Ukraine itself demonstrates that even despite a war, agreements with Russia can be forged. In fact, the only example of an agreement between Europe, Russia, and Ukraine in those years was the energy agreement, the gas agreement. So in that mental construction, in that age of pragmatism, where indeed we weren't so starry-eyed about, the world being a wonderful place, but still there was this kind of understanding of Ukraine as being a bridge. Now we are in an age of war. And if we are to use the metaphor of a bridge, it's a drawbridge and it's up. I mean, very, very clearly. In an age of war, not only in the kind of obvious sense, in the sense that there's a war in Ukraine, but in an age of war in a far more fundamental sense. I think there is an understanding that we have exited the post-war era. And in that post-war era, there was something called the Cold War. So it wasn't exactly all sort of, rosy. But even that is over, I mean, going back to the discussions that we were having earlier, I find it personally very difficult to see how all of this could settle into a new Cold War. I mean, the Cold War was fought between two adversaries, the United States and the Soviet Union, that had fought on the same side of the hot war, meaning the Second World War. So how can now a hot war, where obviously we're not exactly fighting on the same side, settle into some sort of, new Iron Curtain? So the drawbridge up is, in a sense, has an even more dramatic meaning than what it did, I think, during the Cold War, precisely because of this exiting from a post-war era, and not quite clear whether that leads to a pre-war era, an interwar era, or God knows what, given that none of us have a crystal ball. But we do know that we have exited the period that we have been in since 1945.
Yes, precisely. And it's interesting how this new era will be named, how it will be defined, and what will be the strategy, also the policy in this new post-Cold War era unleashed by Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So, thank you, Natalie. And I see already that there are people on our panel who would want to intervene. So please, I'll start with you, Heather, please.
Well, I'd like to take up this challenge we've been discussing about how Ukraine makes its European choice and how the EU could move forward on all of this, because it's already feeding into all of the insecurities about the EU, what it is, what it should be in the future, is it deep enough, and so on. So I want to make a very concrete and practical proposal for discussion on all of this, and that's for Ukraine to have a very special kind of membership in the EU that comes very soon. Doesn't take 20 years, as Natalie was pointing out. Nicola, of course, has lived this. Doesn't depend on having full territorial integrity, which is a big German concern and has been one of the arguments against giving candidate status. Doesn't even depend on Ukraine having full control of its territory in practical terms. And that's green membership of the EU. I think you would say in the Ukrainian, Zeleny chlenstvo, or maybe we would say Zelensky chlenstvo. And the idea of green membership would be to give Ukraine immediate full membership of the European Green Deal, to bring Ukraine fully into what the EU is already doing through a very ambitious program, which includes a lot of money as well as practical help, to transform the European economy into sustainability. So this would be a very practical way of helping Ukraine, because it means, for example, a way of freeing Ukraine and indeed Moldova from dependence on Russian hydrocarbons. The EU has come out with its own, or the Commission came out with the Repower EU package to 2 days ago with financing and ambitions for phasing out of Russian fossil fuels by 2027 in the EU. So the EU should be making a similar effort also for its neighbours and future members in order to ensure that they can't be held hostage, also on the energy side, and of course the importance to the economy of transit fees, and actually integrating in a practical way into the European energy system. Now, we've already seen in just the past couple of months how fast Ukraine has continued to operate very impressively as a government. But, for example, doing a synchronization of the Ukrainian electricity system with the European grid, that was and Moldova did this too, immense achievement in these circumstances. Also getting the reverse flow of gas working so that it's much harder for Russia to cut off Ukraine from gas supplies by allowing that to happen across Europe. And of course, reconstructing Ukraine, the issue we're talking about here, rebuilding Ukraine as a green economy based on renewables, which allows a leapfrogging technologically from the current infrastructure to the new one with EU help and financing and this full practical integration. Now, Kaja Kallas and Dimitri Kuleba both pointed out the vital need to help Ukraine because the aggression will come to us next. Kaja Kallas pointed out how close Vienna is to Kiev. That's also the case in terms of energy dependence and energy security. So we could start even with Western Ukraine already right now. Because it's possible to start doing this very practically. And it's really important to give a very clear signal to the Ukrainian people that their European choice is recognized. Rather than waiting for 20 years and transcribing 100,000 pages of the acquis communautaire, the EU's legal basis, into Ukrainian law and all of the other things, all of the other requirements which are needed for full membership of the EU, but which are frankly not very practical for a country that needs to focus on the immediate needs. This is a way of ensuring that there is a clear commitment and already practical integration, and also one which allows a sustainable future, literally sustainable in the sense of a stable climate and economy, as well as full integration into Europe. Now, I think the main thing to be aware of is, of course, partial integration. You could argue creates a two-tier EU or a three-tier EU. But we have that already. We have some countries which are not fully part of different parts of the EU. I won't go into that. But we also have countries which are declaring unilaterally that they don't want to be part of the EU, even though they are EU members. And I hope that Zsuzsa and Marta will talk about the way that's happened in Hungary with rule of law. So given that that's happening already, let's make it real, let's make it practical, and let's make it green.
Thank you so much, Heather. That's a very interesting idea and an ambitious plan, but I would say that from the Ukrainian perspective, it does not necessarily contradict the desire to be granted an EU candidate status.
Yeah, so it's a staging post along the way, exactly what Natalie was talking about, the need to show the real commitment of the European Union.
Yes, exactly, but also the EU candidate status, which would come in June, if it comes, that would be, it's the moment is ripe for it, and it would be a powerful signal also when not only people in the West are feeling the war fatigue, but Ukrainians are also psychologically tiring. It's difficult to continue this remarkable, amazing resistance. It's having a toll on all of us, so that would send a boost, and it would be a moral boost, for Ukrainians as well. So thank you for your remarks, and I'll give the floor to Florence, and I see that a lot of people are now wanting to join the debate, so I'll ask you to be concise in your presentations, please.
Thank you, Olga. The question posed to us is, how should Ukraine be rebuilt? But isn't the question rather tied to the end of the war, how the war will actually end? And what I'm going to say is more towards our Western European friends and to the Ukrainians who are living this at the moment. But for a lot of Europeans, this is a rediscovery of war, of a phenomenon that I've studied for more than 2 decades. And they were lulled in this idea that war is on its way out and it doesn't exist anymore. Well, unfortunately, the statistics speak a completely different language. We were, before February, 138 years away from breaking the record for the longest time in human history of peace. So we were living a long peace, but we were far away from having entered something completely new in human history. Wars have not become less lethal since Waterloo, since 1815. Whatever people want you to believe about precision-guided weapons, war has been deadly for over 200 years. And wars don't end fast. They last on average 15 months when it's a war between two states. They last a lot longer when it's civil wars. So I think this is an important reality, because something that bothers me, and Natalie touched on this, is because we see war primarily as something that's about death and destruction, we want it to end as fast as possible. But a war isn't just about death and destruction. It's about a conflict that's behind the death and the destruction. It's not just about ending death and destruction, it's about ending the conflict. Now, how do you end a conflict? Well, because if you have a bad peace, every bad peace fathers a new conflict. If you look at the Middle East, the region that I've worked on a lot, every conflict you see is essentially the descendant of another conflict. So good conflict here is not one that ends fast, it's one that ends very clearly, that makes it clear to Russia that this can never happen again. So this, of course, is a price that primarily Ukraine will pay in terms of lives and in terms of destruction. But I think the shorter way out ultimately is the longer way out. And I think that's something, despite war fatigue, both Ukraine and its allies have to be ready for.
Thank you very much, Florence. Yeah, the thing you said, every bad peace fathers a new conflict. I think it's very relevant, also in the context of Ukraine, because we had Minsk agreements, which were not perfect, and which obviously didn't work and didn't stop Russia from waging a full-scale war on Ukraine. So now we should also learn lessons from the Minsk agreements and how do we make sure that a new agreement, when the time comes, does not repeat the same mistakes. And maybe the guarantors also, the parties at the negotiating table should also change, learning from the past mistakes that were committed. I see that Zuzana has been holding her sign for a long time, so please, can you bring in your expertise on Hungary? I think you would want to respond to your country being mentioned by Natalie.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was somehow called into this discussion. I didn't think I can add much of Ukraine's rebuilding, but now I think I can, because of course we have all the examples and also certain learning experience now from Hungary. And so I'd like to make 2 points or contribute in two ways, and one is about time and keeping up the momentum. I think it's absolutely fascinating what we see from the Ukrainian people in the last 2-3 months, actually more than anyone ever expected, right? I think the behavior of the Ukrainian people creating a commitment of the West, which was not necessarily there in the middle of February, I believe. So I think, of course, as you said, there is a fatigue, and it's very, very obvious. It's very difficult to maintain, to be so committed and resisting under such a very, very difficult situation. So the question is how you can maintain the momentum for a moral obligation from the West to help Ukraine. And I think what the Hungary experience can add to this is that this moral obligation can disappear very quickly. It took a couple of weeks only after the war broke out in Ukraine that Hungarians basically gave up their moral support, because the prime minister was running a very different narrative, which was not on moral base, but was basically an interest-based, egoistic narrative that was not against Ukraine. It was just uncommitted. It just said it's not our war. He just said we don't want to pay for this. It's too expensive. It's not our business, and he won an election in an extraordinary victory, which was really very surprising for many of us. So this is why I think that maintaining the momentum is very important. And what comes out of this? I mean, everything should be done from those who want to help Ukraine and for the Ukrainians to do here and now, and to make out the most commitment, financial or political, from Europe as soon as possible, as far as it's possible. And I think it's very important that this is obviously one of the key themes of the day. The other thing, what I'd like to say is about this ideology-based issue what Natalie raised, and also the conflict that Florence said, because and this is a much longer term issue that you definitely cannot do here and today, and not even the next couple of days. If we also have a look in Hungary, what drives, what supports Orban's politics is it's easily can be drawn back to the bad peace and after the First World War. That you still can raise a storytelling in politics that there was something unjust with us and we lost our empire 100 years ago, right? And you can still build, even not openly speaking about. So that's another issue regarding Russia. On the long term, and I think probably Russians around much smarter and well aware of the situation. I mean, how can a people, a nation, and its elite elaborate on our own past and get a peace with that we are not big any longer? And I think that's something relevant for actually many other countries, not just Hungary and Russia.
Thank you, Zsuzsanna. You raised a very important issue of that of the unity also in the West and of the response to the war in Ukraine and the solidarity. And in fact, Hungary was one of the first countries that started to express these doubts and put in its own interests in front. And of course, in Ukraine, there is a lot of, I would say, disappointment with the position of the Orban government, especially on the sanctions, on the oil embargo. And I think it's up, of course, to the people within the EU also to think of this unity, of how to overcome these cracks that are emerging, not just on Ukraine, but on other important issues. And it's just one example. So thank you for your contribution. And Dimitrov, I see that you have something to say, please.
Yeah, thanks, Olga. Just to follow up on something that Heather said and others, the European vocation of Ukraine is being realized by osmosis, not just by institutional arrangements or institutional choice. Just think about the trade redirection, the energy bit, but also society, and something that has been happening for a long time, certainly since 2004 when Poland joined. Now is reinforced by the war in the sense that Ukrainians are heading even greater numbers to the West. And I think that's one of the effects of this conflict, embedding one way or the other Ukrainian society much more into Europe. So it's not just a matter of high politics or elite choices, it's also a social, economic reality. So that's Europeanization from the bottom up, if you will. The question to me, though, is, again, the issue of agency. And that's something that we discovered that actually Ukraine has agency and Ukrainian people do. But once you become part of the Eurosphere, as it were, how do those Ukrainians who have a stake in the system actually have input into it, given that Ukraine won't have membership in the observable future? Maybe there'll be an alternative arrangement. So that's one thing to put on the table, how you empower, in terms of European politics, those Ukrainians who informally are already part of the political sphere in Europe. My second question, it's more of a question than a comment, is inspired by an interview Zelensky gave to a liberal Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, where he famously said, I wish that Ukraine, at the end of this road, would become yet another liberal European country. But the sad reality is that it will be a nation at arms. And it chimes in with what Florence and others said about the impact of conflict. So it will be sort of a society schooled in war, accustomed to conflicts, even if it will be living in the gray zone between war and peace. And it will be a different civic culture. I mean, there's the flip side of forging a common civic identity, that also it will be connected to war. So my question to the speakers and to you is, does that matter in terms of this European ambition, that Ukraine will be different, not by choice but by circumstance? That it will be Israel on a grand scale on the periphery of Europe? Or is it something that we celebrate, that actually have this Marshall nation there? I mean, what do you make of this statement that Zelensky made? And to Serhii as well, and to Natalie, of course.
Yes, thank you for this question. Well, I think it is also rooted on this perception of Israel as, while heavily militarized, but also very successful country in terms of the economy, in terms of the modern technologies. So I think partially Zelensky was referring to that he wants to see Ukraine as a country with a vibrant economy, with a forefront of modern technologies and progress. At the same time, I think Ukraine has shown, and Ukrainians have shown over the years, that they will not tolerate an illiberal, autocratic system of governance. The two democratic revolutions in Ukraine and the fight now, it's not just the fight to preserve Ukraine's independence, but it's to preserve Ukraine's democracy. So I think this war, it also makes even those people who maybe were not thinking as much about the value of democracy and the freedoms it entails, these people are reassessing the situation and are starting to value it more, because they see this very directly, this clash between the autocratic aggressor country and the Russian soldiers who do not understand how come a village head in Ukraine does not control his people, how come he's not appointed, how come he's elected, how come the same person can govern for 20 years, not because he was appointed from above, but because people trusted him, because they liked what he was doing, how he was changing things. So I think kind of Ukrainians are also developing an antidote against illiberalism and against tyranny and authoritarianism in this war. And I hope, certainly, that this is the thing that will last, that will be there for generations to come. So I don't know if that answers your question. I invite other participants to express their thoughts on that. Maybe, Serhii, you will want to add something. Please turn on your microphone. Yeah. You have the. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Now it's.
Okay. Good. In terms of democracy, Ukraine presents a relatively rare case on the post-Soviet space. Its two Slavic neighbors, Russia and Belarus, are competing in the contest of who is more authoritarian. And the majority of the post-Soviet space, especially when you look at Central Asia, the flirt with democracy lasted for a few years, 1990s maximum. Ukraine turned out to be an exception, again, not the only exception, but one of very few exceptions in the post-Soviet space, for a number of reasons. And one of them was the regional diversity of the country, the ethnic, the linguistic, the cultural diversity. There was a situation where in the parliament, before the war started in 2014, there was no chance for one party to dominate and control. And this is exactly, I agree with Olga, the democracy and democratic institutions and loyalty to the democratic institutions that are being defended, and again, they're closely associated with the idea of Europe, that are being defended in this war. because the war started with the idea, especially in 2014, that if you are speaking Russian language, you are Russian and your loyalty is supposed to be to Russia and to Kremlin. And Ukraine survived and survives in this war by mobilizing across the linguistic and cultural, religious and other lines. You just look at the ethnic background of the president of Ukraine, of the minister of defense, of key people in the government and in the army. It is a very diverse picture. The story is also of this resistance that we have is the story of seeing what happened in Donbass. Not only in economic terms, but also in terms of the political transformation of the region. And Crimea, which has been doing economically better, but again, the ideas that you can express in political space, your position and defend it and things like that, are completely unacceptable, anathema. Even those Ukrainian politicians who switched sides in 2014 and were awarded for that being appointed to the Russian parliament, then being at a loss when they realize that they can't actually take any position and try to defend it. So it is about democracy as is perceived as a European value, and I just don't see how that can go away, especially given that the war that is being waged in Ukraine, it is the war that is very much also fought from below. The Zelensky's leadership is pretty much inspirational leadership. So that's a question about the democracy and liberal institutions and what will happen with them once Ukraine is member of the European Union. Where I see the major issue and the major problem is basically institutions per se, the strength of those institutions, and the change of the Ukrainian attitude towards state and institutions that is already happening in the process of this war as we speak. Because Ukraine as a nation survived and as a national project survived in opposition to the state. The state traditionally was somebody else. So for Russians it's very difficult, and I generalize, to imagine life outside of the state. For Ukrainians, the major challenge was actually the trust into the state, the trust into the institutions, including the institution of presidency, including the parliament, and so on and so forth. This is changing slowly, but it is changing now, and that's where I see the next frontier, the next big political challenge for Ukraine. And regarding return of the Cold War, yes, how we can go from the hot war to how we freeze the war. Because concern in 2014, 2015 was that in Donbass we will get another frozen conflict. And it turned out to be that was not a concern. That would be a relatively ideal solution under the circumstances. That was not achieved. So it's a good question. One thing, again, as a historian, I can say there is some hope there, because the global Cold War, not just the European Cold War, was inaugurated in the midst of the war in Korea, in the hot war in Korea. So again, at least historically speaking, there is some hope there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Serhii. And from my observations also, having been in Ukraine since the start of this war, it's just the first time that I left Ukraine since the invasion began. I can say that I'm also seeing changes on the level of trust, social trust between both the people, and we see this manifested in this huge also volunteer effort to support Ukrainian armed forces, also to support internally displaced people. People are donating money, they are bringing, everything that is needed. They are mobilizing to help other people that they do not know. This, of course, is about trust in the society, but this is something that has been problematic in Ukraine previously as well. And I see it changing. I see people uniting and taking care of each other on an unprecedented scale. And I think that that will translate also in a higher trust in the institutions, because we've seen the polls results that indicate that the level of trust in the government and in the president is also at an unprecedented level in Ukraine, and this is also into months into the war, so it was not just one-off thing at the beginning of war. President Zelensky is not leading as a strongman, he's leading as a person who represents the Ukrainian society, and people support him because they do not kind of see him as a guiding light, as someone who indicates the course, but they see that he actually understands what people want, and he reflects their will and their determination and their desires. So it's a bottom-up, again, thing. So hopefully this will contribute into, strengthening the trust into Ukrainian institutions, and this thing will be staying there, because maybe for the first time in also my work as a journalist in Ukraine, I see this unity also between what people want and what the government is doing. Of course, there is still criticism. Of course, it's always there in Ukraine. There is still criticism. There is still a lot of debates on social media about this or that decision. But in general, there is a unity and there is a feeling that we are all doing like a common fighting for the common cause, and the government is representing the people. So, and I want to give the floor now to Ivan Krastev.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to go back to Natalie's questions on when. Because she was very importantly saying, imagine that situation is going to remain in the way it is. And what we see is not a frozen conflict. It is a low-intensity war. Even if it's going to go, this is not a frozen conflict. And if you have a low-intensity war, in my view, three interesting things comes, and some of them very much goes where also basically Dimitrov Bechev is saying. One is the choices that the refugee who are in Europe are going to face. You have around 6 million people, the majority of the kids of Ukraine outside. If you imagine a low-intensity war going for more than 2 years, these kids go to school, basically they're going to be settled in places, and the return is not an option. And honestly speaking, in many of the countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, they're going to be very well received. Eastern Europe is a very depopulated place. The view of the Ukrainian refugees are totally different. But for Ukraine, this is going to be a major demographic problem. This is the youth of the country, the kids outside of the country. So in a low-intensity war, you're not simply destroying physical infrastructure, you're destroying the human capital of the country. And the second thing that is happening is Ukraine is going to be a democracy, but the war democracy has a different decision-making nature than a peace democracy. In a certain way, you cannot imagine that President Zelensky becoming a member of the European Union is going to wait for the European Council in 2 months to take a certain decision if your country is in a war and basically the war has a totally different dynamics. I'm saying this because, this is my last point, the border between Ukraine and Russia is already the border between the West and Russia, regardless of what we're talking. This is the border. The problem is that, in my view, it's impossible to imagine that you can simply integrate Ukraine in the European Union in which it is now. Strangely enough, the war democracy is going to transform European Union more than the European Union can transform a war democracy because of the emergency nature of the situation. And I do believe this is part of the questions that we should also kind of face.
Thank you, Ivan. We are having only 30 minutes remaining, and I want to give the floor to the audience as well. So please, I will ask the speakers who want to speak now to be very brief. And I'll start with Karolina.
Thank you so much for those presentations. I have learned a lot already in the morning of today. And I would like to go back to the subject of our panel, which is rebuilding. And we have heard a lot about rebuilding infrastructure and economy and politics, and also regional order. But I would like to suggest that there is also one more thing that might be or might not be rebuilt, and this is trust. So it is the realm of collective emotions. And trust. Whilst I was listening to you, I have been thinking about the beautiful book by Malaparte, which is called Kaput. Kaput means broken. And in his wonderful book, Malaparte describes the many phases of destruction during the Second World War, including the Eastern Front. So basically, when I read Malaparte today, I think about Bucha. And the question that Malaparte poses is how to regain trust to the world when you have experienced and witnessed evil to such an extent. In the European Union, we have built the whole intellectual, moral, and judiciary structure of the European Union on the notion of evil that has happened in the heart of Europe. Now, Ukraine is the heart of Europe, and the evil that is being done to Ukraine is becoming the heart of not only of Ukraine but also of European Union. So the question, I must say I have more questions than comments today. The question is what we do about this evil in judiciary, institutional, intellectual, and moral terms.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carolina. This question also of bringing the perpetrators of the crimes to justice is something that is really important for Ukraine. A lot of Ukrainians are determined to make this happen. And I mentioned that the first trial started 2 days ago. This, I think, should be a priority not just of Ukraine. And there are already international investigators and the prosecutors working on the ground with Ukraine. But there should be also a political commitment, I think, of the wider world, of the Western world, that these crimes should be punished and that the aggression committed by Russia should not go unpunished. There should be no return to business as usual in any form. So, Hristo, please.
Thank you. Very briefly, want to talk or to ask a question about the elephant in the room, which is NATO. We obviously are aware that integration with the European Union is a precondition to a proper rebuilding of Ukraine. At some point, it will happen. But I'm afraid we don't have an example of another successful transition, economic transition of any East European, Central European country that has not gone through NATO accession before it actually starts attracting investment. And in the Ukrainian case, everything is on steroids. We will need reinvestment. We will need foreign investment to come in addition to whatever Marshall Plan-like state-driven investment or institutional-driven investment comes into Ukraine. But in every other country, and it's a question also for Dimitrov and for Ivan, in every other East European country, we saw a two-stage boost of money coming into those countries. First, NATO accession provided some certainty against some very vague at that time war threat, which now is not very vague at all. And only then later, in some countries many years later, in other countries very shortly after that, the EU accession brought certainty to foreign investors from the perils of corruption. And in this case, the question of NATO accession is parked because it's touchy, but I'm afraid that unless something like NATO, something like a predictable security guarantee is offered to foreign investors, then there's no hope for them to come back into Ukraine.
Yes, absolutely. The issue of security and some sort of integration of Ukraine into the security architecture is essential. No investment, no rebuilding can be durable, can be sustainable without that. So, absolutely, I agree. And now I'll give the floor to Gerard and Anna, and then please, audience, feel free to ask your questions. And Ivana, yes. So, Ivana, please go.
I just have one comment to Heather's point to include Ukraine to European Green Deal. We kind of forgot talking about this blackmail by Russia with fossil fuels that in October last year, Putin adopted Russia climate neutral 2060 strategy. So maybe to have it somewhere in mind concerning Russia's huge potential for, renewable energy because of its vastness of, wind, sun, whatever. That's one point to maybe have somewhere in mind. And second is about trust, reconciliation, and we will talk about it in our panel of the Balkans because I think it's really important experience. I'm not sure that there was any trust between Ukraine and Russia, you know, from the 90s, from the independence of Ukraine. I may be wrong, but, you know, that's just my point. We can discuss it later over coffee. And to persecute war crimes in the situation which I adored your points, Natalie, brilliant points of, you know, moving to God knows what era. I love that point that you made. Is to talk about how to bring justice to war crimes. What court will be in charge for what kind of crimes? Because Russia is still a permanent member of UN Security Council. So something just to think about on this way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana. And Gerard, please.
Thank you. Well, just to add one fact on this debate on refugees and the war and how this affects EU-Ukrainian relations. We've had 3.4 million Ukrainians enter Poland between the beginning of the war and now, middle of May. But we also had 1.3 million Ukrainians leave Poland back to Ukraine. 1.3 million. That means the net is 2.1 million through the Polish-Ukrainian border. And in the last week, more Ukrainians have gone back to Ukraine than have entered Poland. So what we are seeing is a situation, this is still the biggest refugee crisis since the 40s, clear. We've had 3 million people leave Ukraine in the first 3 weeks, but we have people that the moment the war turned in some parts of Ukraine, they try to go back. So if we are interested in seeing, you know, people who want to go back, I mean, it's been the loss of the Battle of Kiev, it's been the loss of the Battle of Kharkiv, it's been the sense that there is territory which is safe that immediately led to hundreds of thousands. Just in May, 330,000 Ukrainians have gone from Poland back to Ukraine. So this is one issue. I think there's a second one that is very important, and that gets us to what the decisions Europeans need to take. Ukraine basically today has freedom of movement for people. Any Ukrainian not only has the right for visa-free travel, but can reside anywhere in the EU, can work anywhere in the EU. I think it would be inconceivable, but it needs to be put out openly, to take this away again. So the real concrete issue for European-Ukrainian relations is to ensure that this freedom of movement is not going to be taken away in 1 year or 1.5 years, because if that happens, what will happen? We've seen it with the experience of the guest workers. When guest workers came to European countries and then visas or residence restrictions were introduced afterwards, they brought their families to join them in the European Union. When you leave freedom of movement, people go back and forth, and depending if Ukraine develops, people will go back. If it doesn't develop, like Moldova, you know, that you don't need a war, people will leave. So the question will then be, is Ukraine developing, which of course is what we will all discuss. But the worst possible signal, and this is why we are not talking abstract issues of the EU acquis, is the European Union willing to tell Ukrainians that the 4 freedoms, including the freedom of movement, which Ukrainians have today to reside in the EU, are going to be preserved, or are they going to be taken away again? And that is going to be a crucial, very concrete issue that will affect millions of Ukrainians. And I think the European Union should give a very clear signal as soon as possible. And Ukrainian politicians, when they talk about EU-Ukraine, absolutely candidate status, that's the key symbol of a European credible offer. But these functional issues of the freedoms that Ukrainians need, including for people, should be at the center of discussions now, while the sympathy for Ukraine is biggest across Europe. Now you should lock this in, sign something that is binding and say Ukraine will keep the 4 freedoms, or develop them, but keep them for freedom of people.
Thank you, Gerald. I think it's an excellent point, and that while Ukraine had visa-free travel with the EU, of course now Ukrainian citizens can, as you rightly said, work in the European Union countries and reside there legally for a longer time than it was permitted previously under the regulation. Actually, that's also very important from the point of view of people who might be settling temporarily somewhere in Europe, but they have plans to return to Ukraine once it's safe, and we are seeing those people who are returning, they had this plan, so they see that that Kyiv or some other parts of Ukraine are now relatively safe, so they are returning. But they also, if they decide to stay, if they have family there, and they are not binded by this desire to reunite the family because there are these very strict rules of travel, they will be sending money, they will be investing into the development of Ukrainian economy, they will be sending remittances, so this is a crucial point. Thank you. And Anna, please.
Hello. If we speak about rebuilding of Ukraine after the war, I would like to bring one point. It's about actually literal rebuilding of cultural sites, because if UNESCO recorded over 120 cases of damage or complete destruction of cultural sites, including museums, historical buildings, libraries, and religious institutions. And I think this is what also very important to think about, and Ukraine will need a lot of support and professional help. And yeah, this is what I want to say.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, I see that Nicola Dimitrov also wants to take the floor, and I do not unfortunately see whether there are questions from the audience because the light is blinding, so if after Nicola someone can help me to identify if there are speakers who want to ask questions, please.
Thank you, Olga. A fascinating discussion. I'm going to keep the analogies and the points Western Balkans and Ukraine for our session. I just want to underscore what Serhii raised in his introduction, that this narrative and the reasons and the Maidan is essentially everything is a European story, not the geography. Why? The question why this started is totally interlinked with the European Union. In a way, the Ukrainians took the European Union magnetism of values extremely seriously. They're fighting and dying for it. So it's a triumph of this value-based offer of the European Union. Putin also took this seriously because a vibrant, prosperous Ukrainian democracy can well be an inspiration for its bigger neighbor. But the big question, and we are yet to receive the answer, is whether the European Union itself takes this seriously, and whether the Union will be able to live up to the expectations it creates itself. And we will see the response to this in June with the candidate status. From what I see, this is not yet a given. There's still some question marks. Probably we will have an opportunity to discuss this further also in our session. But we will see whether the EU will be politically brave to live up to these expectations and to embrace its own triumph.
Thank you, Nicola. So we have 15 minutes. I think that will be enough for 3 questions, but if the answers are quick, then maybe we'll have time for more. So one over there, please. And please indicate also who do you want to answer your question if you have a preference.
Hello, my name is Sonia Koshkina. I'm Ukrainian journalist, editor-in-chief of one of the biggest Ukrainian online media, LB.ua. And my question is for Serhii Plokhy. We see that Putin's action are widely supported by Russians. And it's about whole nation, maybe with some small exceptions. How you may explain it? It's only about propaganda or maybe some another reasons. And the second question, very short and very clear question. Will Ukrainians be able to forgive Russian people?
Thank you. Serhii, please.
Thank you very much for this question. The final part was, will the Ukrainians be able to do what?
Forgive Russian people.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of the support for the war in Russia today, and I know myself from reaction of my friends and colleagues, it is a huge shocker for Ukrainians in particular. No one believed really in the statement that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people, but there was an assumption that the people were close, not only in terms of the language, but in terms of the actual perception and worldview. And one thing that this war demonstrated was that it was a wrong assumption, that really the societies turned out to be different and certainly moving in a different direction since 1991. I and probably others in the audience who remember 1991 and 1990 remember also euphoria, the idea that somehow overnight, once you remove the communist regime, the societies can turn free. And that was their natural desire. And history came to an end. The liberal democracy was winning. And one thing that we learned in these 30 years is that things don't happen overnight. And we deal here with the society, in particular Russian society, that has been historically long, not just in the course of the last 20 years, really formed and accustomed to the existence in the different forms of authoritarian regimes. And while I am overall optimistic about Russia in the long future, I don't believe in miracles, I don't believe in revolutions, I believe in evolution. In terms of forgive, never forget, I don't think it would be possible. In terms of forgiving, I am more optimistic about the future generations than the ones who are living through that, or the next two generations. This is the damage, this is the wound that is still being expanded. But in the long term, I'm coming from US where I teach now, and as a historian, I know the relations between UK and US and peoples in the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, and the War of Independence in the United States. So time heals, but actually it heals only if the injustices, and that's what we were talked about, were addressed. So one key precondition for whatever forgiveness happens, and I don't think it happens soon, is that justice has to be done.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Please, gentlemen in the front row.
Thank you. Well, I would like to go back for a moment to the when issue, because this seems to me important. We have still a hot war and not a cold war in the Ukraine. And what worries me most at the moment is the question, to what degree is Russia prepared to use more 30 weapons? A first example we had recently after the European contest when they used a bomb which is clearly forbidden. So, do we have in Europe a proper response if such things happen more often in the future? The second point I would like to mention is the candidate status. Well, this is a symbol, but we must be clear, this is not more. And I think just to make a decision in the next European Council and then start the usual process, this wouldn't help at all the Ukrainians. So I very much support the idea of Mr. Knaus. We must discuss content in Europe, in the European Union. the four freedoms, for example. But I would see several other chapters which can be concluded with Ukraine without membership or before membership. And if we don't do that, then we will not reach a major effect also with a kind of Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan is primarily about money, but if you remember what the Marshall Plan, the content of the Marshall Plan, it was more. And I think it should be more also in the context with the Ukraine. Because we must be a bit careful, I think, in the sense, does anybody believe here in this room that Russia will ever sign up a peace treaty without the clause which says membership in the Union and membership in NATO is excluded? So are we prepared to deal with this aspect? And I think the most important point is that we are very clear that Ukraine is a European country, is part of our understanding of democracy, is part of our understanding of society, and we have to do the utmost that we contribute to make this happen as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone who volunteers to answer this question, please, Heather?
Yes, it's absolutely true and right that there are aspects of EU membership that Ukraine could move into very quickly, not only closing chapters in the negotiations as they're set up, but also parts of the EU. And in fact, Ukraine has made great progress in the years before the war on alignment, regulatory alignment with the EU, ahead of, for example, some of the Balkan countries. So there definitely practical things can be done. The issue is political will. And particularly, I think there are two big political issues on the EU side which are not about Ukraine, but which ensnare the Ukrainian candidate question in deep EU debates where it's very hard for them to get the member states to agree. So one of them is about the integrity of the accession process. So it's not just the question of, should Ukraine be allowed to leapfrog Macedonia? I think there are good reasons why North Macedonia, should maintain its position after all the hard work in previous governments. But it's actually more about that EU membership should be a very serious deal, which involves fully taking on the whole gamut of EU rules and regulations and being fully prepared to play a role as an EU member state. And given how much that is now threatened by the rollback on rule of law in some of the member states, that makes a lot of members really reluctant to allow anything other than fully meeting the criteria. But having said that, there's another debate within the EU which I think is very helpful to Ukraine and which the immense and amazing media skills of President Zelensky should be put on, which is Ukraine wants to be part of key elements of the EU, where the EU could easily engage Ukraine. And this feeds into the ideas that President Macron of France has put forward for a multi-speed, multi-tier Europe. Now, that's kind of raised fears in some member states, but it's actually a really good thing for Ukraine because it would allow Ukraine to come into parts of the EU, particularly this very important point that Gerald made about the four freedoms, having free movement of persons, and also the freedom to work in the EU labour market, which was a very important and a little bit neglected rather generous offer that was given to Ukraine at the start of the war, which was never been given to anybody else. Generally speaking, people who apply for asylum in the EU are not allowed to work while their application is being processed, which is a huge problem for their integration and their family's integration in the EU, and of course deprives them of the chance of earning a living, whereas Ukrainians can do that. And so this opportunity to go back and forth between the EU labour market and Ukraine is really vital for keeping skills, keeping people engaged, also providing for their families back in Ukraine. So these are the kinds of things that can be offered now. So why not use the opportunity of Macron saying, oh, we need a more speedy Europe, not for yet another sterile debate about treaty change in the EU. This is really not what we want to be spending time on now. It's a diversion and a distraction that is never going to happen, in my view. Too many countries need a referendum, and we don't like referendums anymore. But also, it's distracting time and attention away from what Ukraine needs right now. So yes, use the moment when public support is very high, solidarity is very strong. I feel it's running ahead of the leaders. The political leaders are much more cowardly in the EU at the moment than the European people are. They are opening their homes to Ukrainian refugees. They are actually prepared to take the pain of an embargo on Russian oil and gas. A lot more European citizens are prepared to do that than their politicians. So let's ask our politicians to show the same courage as the Ukrainians.
Thank you so much, Heather. We only have 4 minutes for the last question. I want someone from this side to ask it. So there is, yeah, in the third row. Perfect, yeah. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Irene Gina Reichle, retired ambassador from the Austrian Foreign Ministry. I want to harken back to the mentioning of the Marshall Plan concept, the word and the concept for the rebuilding of Ukraine. And I want to raise the question really, how much of the United States Europe wants in Europe at this point, and where do we think some other major players such as China should be in the equation? Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want someone in particular to address this question? No? Okay. So please, who would like to answer this one? Natalie, please.
On the on the China, I mean, you mean China's role in the rebuilding of Ukraine or China's role in the context of the Ukraine war? Both. So as far as the latter is concerned, I think the question that, in a sense, is a much bigger question than anything that we've talked about so far, is to what extent is this war, in a context in which the international system is being fundamentally reshaped, to what extent is this a reshaping? Earlier I was mentioning the sort of transition away, from a post-war era. To what extent is this a European story, and to what extent is it also a global story? And I think this will largely depend on essentially to what extent is this war going to become a subset of a broader global, in a sense, confrontation, which largely obviously revolves around the United States and China. I think, frankly speaking, the jury to an extent is still out. Politically not, but then the question is economically, which is where I think the second question kind of loops into the first. I mean, politically it's very clear, basically, where China stands, and it stands with Russia. But I think that economically it is actually quite interesting how China has been treading very carefully. Because, in fact, if there is one major difference between the Cold War and whatever it is that we're living through now, is the level of interdependence. And for all the talk about decoupling, there will never be a total decoupling. And so I think it's, in that very fine balancing act, in the sense that China is making, where in a context in which the war, had the war lasted a few days, like probably Putin told Xi in Beijing during the Olympics, then of course politics and economics would have converged. But it hasn't quite gone that way. And so, as I said, I think the jury's still out. To what extent are we going to be tilting more towards the political, which obviously speaks of a Ukraine war, which is a subset of a broader confrontation, and to what extent is economics going to prevail?
If I can jump in on this one, just very briefly. From the others, Turkey will be involved in rebuilding, that's for sure. The construction business is big, Ukraine is a close partner. It will be EU money and Turkish companies, very likely.
Thank you. And actually, we have time for a very short last question, if someone still has it. Okay, no questions from the audience.
Can I?
There is one. Okay, sorry, it's just the light that I didn't see.
Yeah,
please.
absolutely. I'm Leszek Jażdżewski, editor-in-chief of Liberty based in Poland and former Europe Futures Fellow at IWM. I wanted to follow up on what Ivan Krastev said, because the EU enlargement happened in a very much way as the reunification of Germany. So the wall fell, but what really happened was incorporation of the East to the West. And I'm wondering what you even think about the way that this war, you said that the border of the West moving towards the border of Ukraine and Russia. How do you think this war is changing the self-perception, self-image of the European Union? Because European Union has a tendency to think of itself as Europe, even as we saw in the Van der Bellen address. We very much to think of ourselves now as Europe, but it's not really true. So I wonder, how do you think this war is changing the European Union's self-image?
Thank you. Ivan, please.
I do believe we're going to have time to discuss. It's a very important question. But in my view, one thing is changing. And this is that before European Union was always interested how you're going to transform others, and not very much interested how others are transforming European Union in the process of transformation. But in the case of Ukraine, because of a totally different case of integration, this is critically important. First of all, we're talking about a big country in a war, and there is no this type of experience. So unless in the previous, in my view, integration, European Union should understand something very simple. You cannot integrate Ukraine in the way you have been integrating Poland or Bulgaria or Romania. It is about a different European Union, not simply about different Ukraine.
Thank you. So with this, we will have to wrap it up. I thank so much all our participants for the participation and audience also for your engagement.
Olga, thank you very much for your moderation. Thank you to the keynote speakers and all the participants. We will now have a coffee break. At the back of the room, you will be able to have some refreshments and some food. Please promptly be back in half an hour. Thank you very much.